Luke adds a unique narrative to his account of the triumphal entry. Like Matthew and Mark, Jesus instructs his disciples to go find a donkey that he will ride into the city on. And like Matthew and Mark, Jesus rides into the city to the sound of, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." But in Luke, that sound is mingled with another sound, the sound of weeping. Take a look at this. In Luke 19, Jesus enters into the city, but as he drew near, he wept over it, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known this day the things that make for peace. But now it is too late. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set a barricade around you. They will surround you and they will tear you to the ground, leaving not one stone upon another in the temple that will not be thrown down, because you did not know the time of your visitation." Now, Jesus had already predicted the destruction of the temple all the way back in chapter 13. He said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it, your house, the temple, will be forsaken." And he's going to predict the destruction of the temple one more time in the Olivet Discourse. Using the same language from chapter 19, he will say that the days will come when not one stone will be left upon another. But Luke is going to do something rather curious with this Olivet Discourse. The content in this teaching is confined in the book of Matthew to chapters 24 and 25, and in Mark to chapter 13. But in Luke, he's going to take that discourse, chop it up, and scatter it across the travel narrative sections. Take a look at this division of the Olivet Discourse by Luke. So the Olivet Discourse in Matthew, I'm just comparing Luke here to Matthew. All this is in Luke. It is found in Matthew 24, but also in Luke 12. Parts of the discourse from Matthew are located in various sections in Luke 12, about, be like the man who's waiting for their master to come, waiting for the second coming of Jesus in this case. And we also see parts of Matthew 24 in Luke 17. The coming of the Son of Man will be like lightning flashing up in the skies, and then the vultures will gather when the signs of the tribulation are near. But then the majority of the Olivet Discourse is where it should be, here in Luke 21. And you'll notice these sections in purple are unique to Luke, things that he adds. And he makes a couple of critical adjustments, which I think are actually quite helpful. You see, the setting, the chronological setting of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew and Mark is a little bit ambiguous. It's hard to tell. Are we talking about AD 70 and the destruction of the temple, or are we talking about the end times tribulation? But in Luke, he makes that very clear in verses 20 down to 24, clearly setting this period in the first century, AD 70, where he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, purple is just Luke, then you will know that its desolation has come near, for these are days of vengeance and wrath against this people, when this people will be led captive among all nations and trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles must be fulfilled. Of course, this has to be during the period of AD 70. But then down in, I believe really starting in verse 25, but it's abundantly clear in verse 31 that we're definitely talking about the end times again, far beyond AD 70. For it says, when you see all these things taking place, signs in the sun and the moon and the stars, then you will know that the kingdom of God is near, which it will be in the tribulation period. Well, before Jesus prophesies the destruction of the temple in the Olivet Discourse in verses 20 to 24, he's going to symbolically portray that destruction when he cleanses the temple. Now, you remember our discussion of Ezekiel 34, those shepherds of Israel, which were feeding themselves, literally consuming the flock. Well, that's pretty much what the temple establishment had degenerated into. It's just a means for the leadership of Israel to fleece their own people, no pun intended. Well, after Jesus' showdown in the Jerusalem temple, the clock is ticking and Jesus' death is imminent. However, he still has time for one final Passover meal with his disciples. And Luke is going to make a critical Old Testament connection here in this section, which is only just implied in Matthew and Mark. Let's turn to Luke 22, verse 20, to see that Old Testament connection. 22:20. This is the Lord's Supper, where he says, he takes first the bread, which he calls his body, and then the cup, saying that this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. This is Jeremiah 31:31, where God promises to write the law on our hearts. And that new covenant is ratified in the blood of Jesus shed on the cross. And what's interesting here as well is you'll notice the tight connection between the new covenant and the coming future kingdom, where Jesus says, I have desired to eat this Passover meal with you, because I tell you now that I will not eat this meal or drink of this fruit until the kingdom comes in the future. And at that future time, you too, my 12 disciples, will join me at my table in my kingdom and sit on 12 tribes, judging the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, Matthew and Mark are going to strongly claim that it is this trial sequence that clearly demonstrates that Jesus is the king of that coming kingdom. Matthew and Mark make that claim. And while that theme is present in Luke in this section of Jesus's trials before his cross, Luke is going to more strongly emphasize Jesus's innocence during these trials, 6 times repeating the fact that he is innocent. I found no guilt in him. Let's look at those 6 statements of Jesus's innocence in his trial sequence here in 22 to 23. So first, before Pilate, he says, I find no guilt in this man. And then again, Pilate is going to make the same assertion. I do not find this man guilty. And then he's going to send him over to Herod. And Herod's going to say that as well. He's going to find nothing deserving death in Jesus. And Herod's going to send him back to Pilate, who again will say the same thing. I found in him nothing deserving death. And then even there on the cross, one of the criminals will say, this man has done nothing wrong, unlike us who deserve this sentence of condemnation. And then finally, this is very interesting. The centurion, after Jesus dies on the cross, and he feels the earthquake rumble and he sees the sky turning dark, he will say, certainly this man was innocent. Now you remember in Mark, the centurion says, truly this man was the Son of God. But Luke is going to change that language and say that he was innocent in order that he can really emphasize this point, that Jesus is innocent. So many of these statements are found only in Luke. So why? Why is Luke so interested in affirming Jesus's innocence? Well, remember who Luke is writing to and why. He is writing to give Theophilus certainty about the things that he has been taught. Now, Theophilus is a prominent Roman citizen, and he has been told that Christianity is a spiritual, religious movement. It's not a political movement. But if he's been taught that, why is Jesus called a king? And why does it seem like wherever Paul goes throughout the Roman Empire, Paul is always stirring up riots left and right? What kind of a movement am I getting involved in? I'm sure Theophilus has thought on occasion? Well, Luke is going to assure Theophilus that Jesus was innocent in the eyes of the state. But more importantly, Jesus was the blameless lamb and the atoning sacrifice ratifying the new covenant before the eyes of the Father, to whom Jesus prays while hanging on the cross. Have you ever attended a Good Friday service in which the pastor teaches through the 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross? Did you know that if we harmonize the 4 Gospels, you can count up 7 things that Jesus said while he was hanging on the cross? And 3 of them are only found in the Gospel of Luke. Let's look at those specifically, those 7 sayings, 3 of them in Luke. So here they are in the order they took place. And you'll notice that the first 2 and the last one are recorded only in Luke. And how do these sayings reflect the unique emphasis of the Gospel of Luke? Well, let's think about that for a minute. Father, he says, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, we know the theme of Luke is that Jesus, the Son of Man, he who was dying on the cross, came to save lost sinners, even those who are crucifying him and reviling him as he hangs on the cross. And he came to save as well that criminal who was dying beside him in the last hour of his life. And so Jesus says to him, truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. And finally, he concludes his time on the cross by saying, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And with those final words as a testament to his intimate trust in the Father, Jesus dies. And how fitting is it that 3 days later it would be women who are the first witnesses of the empty tomb, which is in itself a powerful apologetic for the historicity of the resurrection, but it also testifies to Jesus's ongoing mission to the poor, to the humble, to those whom the world would not consider worthy. And so on Resurrection Sunday, Jesus is going to appear first to Peter. We think it's kind of hard to tell exactly the order of these events, and then to Mary. We see that in John's gospel, and then to a couple of disciples who are giving up. They're leaving town. They're going back home because their master died, and they think it is all over. They're on the road to Emmaus. And here, with this story, Luke is going to end his gospel where it began, with an affirmation that both the life of Jesus and now also his death fulfills Old Testament hopes. Let's see that with Jesus' appearance to the disciples on the road to Emmaus in chapter 24. So these 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus, they confess to Jesus, though they don't know it's him. We had hoped that our rabbi, Jesus, he would be the one to redeem Israel. There's such an Israel focus here. But Jesus, he rebukes them and says, oh, foolish ones, don't you know that it was necessary that through the death of the Messiah, that is how he would redeem Israel? It was necessary that the Christ should suffer first and enter into his glory. That is what Moses and all the prophets and all the scriptures wrote concerning the Messiah, the anointed one. And then again, to all of the disciples, Jesus would appear and he would explain to them everything written about him in the law of Moses, the prophets, the Psalms, the entire Tanakh. It must be fulfilled. There's that critical word, fulfilled, again. And he opened their minds that they might understand the scriptures. And this word must, it's the word de in Greek. It is a very important word for Luke, repeated many times. we have a list of Luke's use of the word day or must, necessary, in both Luke and Acts, where we see that even from the very beginning of his life, Jesus would say that it is necessary for me to be in my Father's house. He was guided by the sovereign will of his Father even then. It was necessary for Jesus to preach the good news to the poor, to the sinner, to the lost, to the outcast. And it was necessary that he would suffer these things, be rejected, and then be raised. Um, Opening up the living way through the curtain that is his blood into a new covenant relationship of grace with the Father, giving us the confidence that we too, if we die today, will wake up with Jesus in paradise, like the criminal dying beside Jesus on the cross. And continuing now into the book of Acts, following Luke's use of this word, there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. And that name is Jesus of Nazareth. He is the shepherd of lost sheep. And he is the light of revelation to the Gentiles. He is the preacher to the poor, and he is the friend of sinners.